Good morning, everyone. Welcome to First Unitarian Society of Milwaukee. My name is George Bledsoe, and I'm honored to serve as your worship associate today and to welcome you fully in this space. We welcome people of all genders, sexualities, ages, races, ethnicities, histories, and bodies here. We welcome your mind, your heart, and your spirit here. We welcome all you are bringing with you today and all your heart longs to sit down. We welcome all of you. Guests are invited to come early on another Sunday and drop into the Inquirer session at 10:10 a.m. in the parlor, where you can learn more about Unitarian Universalism and our church in a smaller, more casual gathering. We invite our guests to fill out a welcome card located in the pew rack in front of you and drop it in the offering plate later in the service. Guests may also pick up a welcome packet at the back of the sanctuary, where folks will also find hearing assist devices and Braille hymnals. A fragrance-free area is located on the front right side in the first few pews. If you are a visiting family, including children or youth, after the time for all ages noted in your order of service, please join the children's recessional and head across the hall to the common room. There you will be greeted by someone who will orient you to religious education. Immediately following the service, everyone is invited for coffee and conversation in the common room. My name is George Bledsoe, and you can come talk to me at the guest table there. As a way to engage at First Church, I invite everyone to explore the announcements insert for the numerous opportunities available here. In particular, let me draw your attention to a few. January Chronologically Gifted Group, TCG Potluck, will be meeting next Sunday, January the 26th at 12:30 p.m. in Max Auto Hall. As usual, we ask that you bring a dish to share. Dan O'Keefe will be poking fun at our pets, raising children, and relationships in his presentation of poems of Billy Collins and John Kinney. Prepare to have fun. Today is the last day to sign up for Mystery Friends. Children, age 5 and up, and adults of all ages may take part. Each participant will be matched with a mystery pen pal from a different generation. You'll receive your match's contact next week and exchange notes for the next month. Find out more and register at the religious education table or online. Unitarian Universalists Under 40 Doing Activities, UUUFDA, is hosting another board game afternoon on Sunday, February the 2nd, following the second service coffee hour. There will be plenty of board games, but feel free to bring your favorites to share with others. This event is family friendly. All are welcome. Please find details on these and more events in the announcements insert. Finally, please silence any electronic devices for the remainder of the service. Once again, I welcome you to First Church by inviting you to join me in a unison reading of our mission, which is printed in your order of service. We gather to nurture the spirit, engage the mind, and inspire action. At this time, I would like to invite Juanita Mast up to light our chalice.
Our opening words this morning are adapted from My High Resolve by Howard Thurman. Keep fresh before me my moments of high resolve, when it was full-orbed and glorious and resplendent. I was sure I would never forget. I had forgotten how easy it is to forget, but little by little there crept into my life the dust and grist of the journey. Details, lower level demands, all kinds of cross currents, nothing momentous, nothing overwhelming, nothing flagrant, just wear and tear. If there had been some direct challenge, a clear-cut issue, I would have fought it to the end and beyond. But there wasn't. In the quietness of this place, my heart whispers, keep fresh before me my moments of high resolve, that in fair weather or in foul, in good times or in tempests, in the days when the darkness and the foe are nameless or familiar, I may not forget that to which my life is committed.
Good morning. The story I have for you today is called The Other Side by Jacqueline Woodson. That summer, the fence that stretched through the town seemed bigger. We lived in a yellow house on one side of it. White people lived on the other. And Mama said, "Don't climb over that fence when you play." She said it wasn't safe. That summer, there was a girl who wore a pink sweater, and each morning she climbed up on the fence and she stared over to our side. Sometimes I stared back. She never sat on that old fence with anybody. That girl didn't. Once when we were jumping rope, she asked if she could play, and my friend Sandra said no, even without asking the rest of us. I don't know what I would have said. Maybe yes, maybe no. That summer, everyone and everything on the other side of the fence seemed far away. When I asked my mama why, she said, "Because that's the way things have always been." Sometimes when me and Mama went into town, I saw that girl with her mama, and she looked sad sometimes. That girl did. "Don't stare," my mama said. "It's not polite." It rained a lot that summer. On rainy days, that girl, she sat on the fence in a raincoat. She let herself get all wet, and she acted like she didn't care. Sometimes I saw her dancing around in puddles, splashing and laughing. Mama wouldn't let me go out in the rain. "That's why I bought you rainy day toys," she told me. "You stay inside here, where it's warm and dry and safe." But every time it rained, I looked for that girl, and I always found her somewhere near the fence. Someplace in the middle of the summer, the rain stopped, and when I walked outside, the grass was damp, and the sun was already high up in the sky, and I stood there with my hands in the air, and I felt brave that day. I felt free. And I got close to that fence, and that girl, she asked my name. "Clover," I said. "My name's Annie, Annie Paul. I live over yonder by where you see the laundry. That's my blouse hanging on the line." And then she smiled. She had a pretty smile. And then I smiled. And then we just stood there looking at each other, smiling. "It's nice up on this fence," said Annie. "You can see all over." I ran my fingers along the top of the fence. "A fence like this was made for sitting on," Annie said, and she looked at me sideways. "My mama says I shouldn't go on the other side," I said. "My mama says the same thing, but she never said anything about sitting on it." "Neither did mine," I said. So that summer, me and Annie sat on that fence. And when Sandra and them looked at me funny, I just made believe I didn't care. Some mornings my mama watched us, and I waited for her to tell me to get down from that fence till I break my neck or something, but she never did. "I see you made a new friend," she said. I nodded. She smiled. That summer, me and Annie sat on that fence, and we watched the whole wide world around us. One day, Sandra and them were jumping rope near the fence, and we asked if we could play with them, and Sandra said, "I don't care." And so we jumped, and Sandra and me were partners again, just the way we used to. And when we were just too tired to jump anymore, we sat up on the fence, all of us, in a long line. "Someday, somebody's going to come along and knock down this old fence," said Annie. And I nodded. "Yeah," I said, "someday." The end.
So just take a second to feel your body. Do what you need to get comfortable. Maybe you feel your feet on the floor grounding you. or the top of your head connecting you to all that is. Maybe you feel your breath moving in and out of your belly, and you let it bring you into being here and now. Spirit of life and love, Holy One of our being and our becoming, that which is sacred within, among, and beyond us. Ground us in the spirit of love and justice today, on this Martin Luther King Jr. Sunday. Like King and other heroes and sheroes of the civil rights movement, may we connect our individual morals to a larger community ethic. And may the ethic of justice triumph over ethics of domination and white supremacy. And may we be humble servants in the continued turning of the tide. May it be so.
I come from a family that most people would describe as moral and ethical. People in our community had always spoke fondly and respectful of my family as I was growing up, and they still do to this day. I can remember going through the process of applying and interviewing for my first job here in Milwaukee, in which I had to adhere to a background check. I found it interesting when my soon-to-be boss called me to let me know that not only had I passed the background check with flying colors, but that the chief of police had taken the time to write a 2-page letter describing how my family has always been an honored and respected family in the community. Despite the ability to coast along on the ethical path that those in my family had paved for me, I have struggled from time to time in my life with my own morality. In high school, I became ill-mannered due to some social and personal issues, and I had begun to act out in unethical ways. I started to do things like skip class, and I was just simply not the respectful boy that I had been while growing up. One time in high school, a friend and I chose to hide a test folder from our teachers simply because we were not prepared to take the test. Well, we were caught, and my teacher, whom my mother knew very well, proclaimed to me that she could not understand how someone that came from such a great family could act out in such a dishonest manner. In our community at that time, the collaboration between school, family, and the community were still intact, and there was a strong sense of integrity in that system of ethics. I can remember a sense of being raised by a village, as the old African proverb goes. In other words, when I got in trouble at school, it was inevitable that my family and possibly many in the community would know and possibly become involved. We were expected, especially as children, to reflect the ethical balance in the community and to honor the moral codes. It was at this period in my life that I realized that the ethical prestige that my family had established in our community would not be my saving grace, but that I had to establish my own moral compass of right and wrong within myself. The words of my teacher and her analysis of my morals in contrast of the ethics of my family helped me to transition to an understanding of how I have control to do the right or wrong thing at any given time or circumstance. In that, I felt empowered.
At the end of a workday on December 1st of 1955, a 42-year-old black seamstress in Montgomery, Alabama, boarded a segregated bus to go home. She sat in the middle section, which, according to the law and custom of segregation, black riders were allowed to sit in unless the white section at the front of the bus filled. At that point, the bus driver could move the black people back to give the white folks more seats. That day, after the white section filled and a couple of white people were standing, the bus driver stopped the bus, walked up to the middle section, and moved the sign that read "Colored Section" back behind the 4 people that were seated in the first row of the middle section. 3 of those 4 people got up to move, and the 4th person, Rosa Parks, refused. When she was interviewed later, Parks said, "When that white driver stepped back toward us, when he waved his hand and ordered us up and out of our seats, I felt a determination cover my body like a quilt on a winter night." According to Parks, the driver asked if she was going to stand up, and she said, "No, I'm not." And he said, "Well, if you don't stand up, I'm going to have to call the police and have you arrested." And she said, "You may do that." And he did. Rosa Parks has been called the mother of the civil rights movement. She's an American heroine. But telling the story of a lone woman who made an individual decision, or worse, telling the story of a woman who was just tired after a long day at work and didn't want to stand, ignores the larger context of what Rosa Parks did that day. It erases the webs of larger connection and history that led up to that decision for civil disobedience. In her autobiography, Parks said, "People always say that I didn't give up my seat because I was tired, but that is not true. I was not tired physically, or at least no more tired than I usually was at the end of a working day, and I was not old, though sometimes people have an image of me being old then. I was 42. No, the only tired that I was tired of giving in." Rosa Parks was part of a movement. She was a trained activist, and she had been involved in the movement for black rights before her decision to commit civil disobedience on that day on that Montgomery bus. She was the secretary of the Montgomery NAACP when she was arrested, and she had joined the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP 12 years before that day. In her leadership role in that organization, Parks had investigated crimes against black people, organized equal campaigns for justice, and she had even succeeded in registering to vote, despite the ways that segregation laws made that extremely difficult. And 4 days before her act of civil disobedience on that Montgomery bus, Rosa Parks had been at a church meeting about Emmett Till's murder, where she learned that the 2 men who had killed Till had just been acquitted. That news hit Rosa hard. Till's murder had been national news, and still his killers had gotten away with it. She had worked on local cases that had received much less press attention and therefore less pressure for equal justice. And she was sad, and she was angry. 4 days later, when that bus driver asked her to move to the rear of the bus, Parks said, "I thought of Emmett Till, and I could not just go back." The choices that people make, even when they're individual moral choices, they have histories. They are embedded in a larger context of community. We are all embedded in other people, and those people are embedded in us in complex multiplicities of histories. Martin Luther King Jr.'s story has an earlier context in Rosa Parks' story. And Rosa Parks' story has an earlier context in Emmett Till's story. And all of those stories have larger contexts in the histories in which those people grew up and learned who they were. Lone wolves and individual heroes are a myth. The civil rights movement's focus on Rosa Parks' civil disobedience was also a choice with a history. Many Black people were arrested for civil disobedience on segregated buses prior to Rosa Parks' arrest. But the NAACP of Montgomery thought that Rosa Parks' case had the best chance of winning because of her activism and her reputation as an upstanding citizen of Montgomery. Parks was married. She was a little bit older. She had a job. She had a steady reserve and a history of responsibility. And most importantly, she was a trained movement leader who was ready and able to state her case with poignant clarity. They chose Rosa Parks as the ideal symbol and elevated her case as the lead case on segregated buses. In the coming days, leaders in the Black community decided to take the opportunity of Parks' civil disobedience in order to organize a mass bus boycott. 3 days later, at Sunday morning worship services on December 4th of 1955, Black church ministers advertised the Montgomery bus boycott to their congregations. A church rally was held that evening, and the people who assembled there unanimously agreed to boycott the buses. The next morning, Monday, December 5th, 1955, not a single person of 40,000 Black commuters took the bus. It was raining that day, and the vast majority of people walked, some as far as 20 miles. That night at the Mount Zion AME Church, a group of community leaders created the Montgomery Improvement Association and elected a relatively new minister as its president, a 26-year-old man named Martin Luther King Jr. The Black community of Montgomery maintained their boycott for 381 days, through all kinds of weather and sickness and exhaustion and financial stress. They were the majority of the bus company's customers, and the company suffered significant profit loss but did not relent. Dozens of buses simply parked throughout the year of 1956 until the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that bus segregation was unconstitutional, and Montgomery repealed its law requiring segregation on buses. Oftentimes, when we talk about civil rights heroes, we do so in a way that valorizes them, as we should, but does so as though they are individual moral actors, pushing their outstanding morals against the larger society's ethics. In common speech, people often use the words morals and ethics interchangeably, but morality refers to an individual's sense of right and wrong, while ethics refers to a people's shared understanding of right and wrong. Today, the privilege of hindsight allows us to look back and say, as a people, segregation was clearly wrong, but we should remember that at the time, segregation was the law. It was the shared agreement of what was right. It was the agreed upon society norm, and breaking it meant arrest and prosecution. Indeed, when Rosa Parks was arrested, she was quoted as saying to the arresting officer, "Why do you always push us around?" And his response was, "I don't know. But the law is the law, and you're under arrest." The civil rights movement used civil disobedience as a primary tactic in challenging society's ethics, society's definitions of right and wrong. Indeed, in his letter from Birmingham jail, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King wrote, "One not only has a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws." Our civil rights heroes, including King and Parks, were so committed to their morals that they were willing to engage in civil disobedience, to deliberately break society's laws because they were unjust. And so it's still more than simply individual morals that was calling them to challenge the larger society's ethics. King and Parks and other civil rights leaders were part of a movement, and as such, they were deeply in line with their community's ethics. At the church meetings, the night before and the evening of the Montgomery bus boycott, the Black community and its leaders gathered together, and they made decisions by consensus. Rosa Parks was the elected leader of the NAACP in Montgomery, and Dr. Martin Luther King was elected as the president of the Montgomery Improvement Association. These individual moral heroes were actually deeply embedded in relationship, deeply embedded in community that both created them and selected them as representatives. King and Parks were both trained and educated in movement schools and universities. Parks attended a training at the Highlander Folk School in 1955, 4 months before she engaged in her civil disobedience. That Highlander Center trained many of our civil rights leaders, educated them in movement work, and political education became a central pillar of the civil rights movement. When the state of Tennessee shut down the Highlander Center in 1961, it was the Southern Christian Leadership School, of which King was president, that took over the citizenship programs of political education. Those citizenship programs became a cornerstone of multiplying leadership and empowering the civil rights movement. If we want to be a people of integrity, we have to answer the question, with what? With what are we in integrity? With our own personal morals? With the ethics of our community? With the laws of the land? You might have read in this month's church newsletter that our own Terry Wiggins was arrested last month for civil disobedience. With the Milwaukee climate strike, Terry sat down in the downtown Wells Fargo bank, blocking the route to the tellers in protest of Wells Fargo's billions of dollars of investments in fossil fuels and fossil fuel infrastructure. Terry said that she chose to engage in civil disobedience because she believes that climate chaos endangers her and all that she has ever loved, and you and all that you have ever loved. Terry's following her own moral code and pushing back against contemporary society's ethics, both those of fossil fuel dependency and the law. But she's not a lone wolf. She's in relationship. She's a member of First Church and our Earth Justice Ministry, a member of Milwaukee's Interfaith Earth Network, and a member of Milwaukee's 350.org. She's also in relationship with the 10 other people who chose to risk arrest. People like Keisha Patel, co-founder of the Gaia Coalition Network, and Alex Brower of the Milwaukee Teachers Education Association Union. Each of the people that was with Terry were in deep relationship with organizations that they serve and with people that they love. In that room in the bank that day, there were youth and elders, people of color and white folks. And as they were being arrested, they told their stories, talked about why they cared enough to be arrested, what inspired them to follow their own moral code and their community's ethics and deliberately disobey the larger society's ethics. Each one of those stories was about being deeply embedded in an ethic of care for children, care for vulnerable and marginalized people who are suffering from the effects of climate change first, and care for the interdependent web of all existence. Terry said that as she was inside the bank chanting, she could see her 11-year-old granddaughter, 11-year-old granddaughter, Ailish, on the other side of the glass window. Ailish was standing outside with the protesters and the North Division High School marching band, watching Grandma stand firm in her morals, challenging society's ethics in order to try to give Ailish a future. And Terry said that when Ailish blew her a kiss, Terry knew that she was doing the right thing. Tomorrow is Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and people all over this city will be remembering our civil rights heroes and volunteering and trying to make the world a better place, which is wonderful. However, we need to remember that it is a lot easier to valorize heroes from 50 years ago when we have the perspective of history to look back and say, they were right. But at the time, those heroes were challenging society's shared norms and ethics. They were breaking the law at the time. The reason that we can look back and say, yeah, they were right, is because they were successful. They changed society's ethics through their moral challenge. They changed the laws of segregation through their communal ethics challenge to the larger society. And that challenge was based on civil disobedience, breaking the laws that they believed were unjust. At the time, People said of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and of the Civil Rights Movement, "I agree with the message, but I disagree with the tactics," when it was the tactics that got the message out there and helped the movement win. Today, I hear folks say similar things about the Black Lives Matter movement when they shut down the highways, or about climate protesters who block the access route to the tellers at the bank. While the law is the law, as the arresting officer said to Rosa Parks, challenging unjust law and practice is part of upholding our moral code and our Unitarian Universalist community's ethics. The civil rights movement won the battle against legal segregation, but the war against racism and white supremacy is ongoing. We see it all around us today. We can see it in the segregation in Milwaukee and in the current challenge to voting rights in Wisconsin. Like our Unitarian Universalist forebears, we are once again being invited into the work of resisting racism and white supremacy through following the leadership of local people of color-led movements for justice, and in changing our culture of our own congregations away from prioritizing white culture at the expense of people of color. This weekend, about 50 First Church members gathered to participate in a curriculum called Beloved Conversations, which helps congregations reflect on racism and white supremacy in our personal lives, our congregations, and in the world. Together this weekend, we talked and we listened, and we started to think about how we might improve both our personal and our congregational work on racism and white supremacy. In 1968, the Reverend Dr. King warned, quote, "One of the great liabilities of history is that all too many people fail to remain awake through great periods of social change. Every society has its protectors of status quo and its fraternities of the indifferent, who are notorious for sleeping through revolutions. Today, our very survival depends on our ability to stay awake, to adjust to new ideas, and to remain vigilant and face the challenge of change. May we be awake in our period of social change, and may we be inspired by the heroes and heroines of the civil rights movement to support and uphold our own morals and Unitarian Universalist ethics today in the face of the injustice, the racism, and the white supremacy that is still happening in the larger society and right here at home. May it be so.
Every week we have an opportunity to practice our values through sharing our resources. Our pledges are at the core of our spiritual practice of generosity. In addition, the church shares half of all the non-pledged cash in our offering plate with a community organization. In this way, we commit our resources in line with our belief that this congregation is interdependent with the world beyond these walls. Today, we share the plate with Victory Garden Initiative. This organization will work to ensure that communities throughout Milwaukee are taught how to grow and enjoy their own food.
Our responsive reading today is adapted from a speech by Nelson Mandela. I'll begin. We understand it still, that there is no easy road to freedom. You know it well, that none of us acting alone can achieve success. We must therefore together act as a people for reconciliation and the birth of a new world. Let there be justice for all. Let there be peace for all. Let there be work, bread, water, and salt for all. Let each know that for each the body, the mind, and the soul have been freed to fulfill themselves.